23 by James Bernat is there can be agreement as to what constitutes human death. In his statement of the problem, Bernat says the definition of human death was among the very first topics debated by scholars in the early area of biomedical ethics and biophilosophy, but this controversy was absent in the pre-technological era, roughly before 1950, because in that era, death always was a unitary phenomenon. However, the introduction of the positive pressure mechanical ventilator into medical practice in the 1950s permanently altered this interdependent relationship between the organ systems of circulatory and respiratory functions and then later forms of brain functioning. Now, once death ceased to be a unitary phenomenon because of the technologies developed in the 50s, this question arose and was very demanding. Were patients alive or dead who lacked all brain functions, but whose absent spontaneous respiratory and circulatory functions were mechanically supported? What are we going to do about those people? Well, the first physicians who looked at such patients thought that they were different in an important, essential way from all other patients in a coma who'd ever been examined. So a committee of Harvard University physicians and scholars coined what he calls the unfortunately misleading term or phrase, brain death, to describe them. And they said these kinds of patients were actually dead. However, they didn't give you a deep philosophical analysis, he thinks, to prove their intuitive view that these patients were dead. So, the technological advance, he says, of the positive pressure ventilator did not require a change in the definition of human death. The new technology, rather, showed that formerly we lacked an explicit, pay attention to that word explicit, definition of death. Defining death by making explicit the meaning implicit in our ordinary use of the word death was the conceptual task that scholars now had to confront. So, in this article, Bernat says, the question I consider here is whether scholars ever can agree on such a definition of death. Now, he recognizes this is a tall task, okay? Because he's not just asking about whether I can persuade somebody. He's asking whether there can be agreement. Now, some scholars say defining death is impossible or other things, but even among scholars who say, okay, I agree on a definition, there is still disagreement on the criterion of death that's necessary and sufficient to satisfy the definition. We're going to have to talk about some of these different criteria. To identify the sources of disagreement, he says, I'm going to rely on the biophilosophical analytic method that my Dartmouth colleagues and I developed. All right, so much for the introductory comments. So in his section on the biophilosophical analysis of death, Bernat talks about how, look, there's a lot of different views about the definition of death and criteria of death, but he thinks a sequential and systematic analytic method will provide a valuable tool in coming up with a good definition. Why? Well, because it proceeds in a logical order, and it permits one to pinpoint those areas of scholarly disagreement and to clarify the reasons for the disagreement. Okay, so this is a method that doesn't guarantee a solution, but their method consists of four things: paradigm, definition, criterion, and tests. And he talks a little bit about each of these and what they represent. Not all scholars, however, will even agree on this particular method, and it just so happens that the other author in this anthology is one of those who kind of gets off the train at the very first stop. He kind of rejects beginning with an analytic process. However, Bernat says, look, my philosopher colleague at Dartmouth, Bernard Gert, has already refuted Chong's criticism for getting off the train in the very first step of the method. Another pair of scholars, Alan and Elizabeth Schumann, talk a little bit about how death is represented differently in different cultures, but this doesn't have to undercut the method. Okay, so what is the paradigm of death? Here he says there are 7 elements, and again, this is stage 1 of the method. First element, the word death is a common, non-technical word that we all use correctly to refer to the cessation of the life of a human being or another higher vertebrate species. Secondly, in this paradigm, death is fundamentally a biological phenomenon. Third, in this paradigm, we restrict analysis to the death of higher vertebrate species for which death is univocal. In other words, we're talking about the same thing, the same concept of death when we say that our cousin died as we do when we say that our dog died. However, our definition of death does not have to cover simpler organisms like amoeba, or parts of organisms like my skin cell on my pinky finger. All right? He's wanting to focus on the death of higher vertebrate species like dogs and humans. Fourth paradigm part. The term death can be applied directly and categorically only to organisms, right? So it's not going to be strictly the same thing when I say my Macintosh died. 5. A higher vertebrate organism can reside in only one of 2 states, alive or dead. Think of those wanted posters, wanted dead or alive. Okay, that's how every organism is, not in between. 6. Death is best regarded as an event and not a process. This kind of follows straight from the 5th idea. And 7th, death is irreversible. Okay? If the event of death were reversible, it would not really be death, but rather incipient dying that was interrupted and reversed. Okay, so what are some of the challenges to this paradigm of death that he considers? Well, I'm going to quickly go through this part because I want to get to his next stage. He talks about some challenges from scholars Jeff McMahon and John Lizza, different philosophers working on different projects, but they each kind of challenge this paradigm. Lee and George and Schumann or other scholars working either together or apart who have challenged this. However, he says, Gert, Culver, and I require for our paradigm that human beings are only our human organisms, right? He's not wanting to get into the debates about whether we have a human soul or not. And he quotes or references another famous contemporary philosopher named Erik Olson, who wrote a famous book in 1997 called The Human Animal, and he rigorously and expansively defends the position that human beings are our organisms. Okay, now Robert Veitch is a scholar who takes a kind of more libertarian view, but Veitch is not that different in some ways than Bernat. Linda Emanuel is another scholar. Halvey and Brody have another alternative. I'm going to not get into all the details of their views and just say Bernat says that our argument against the position of Halvey and Brody, who think you can be in a transitional state between life and death, where you're not really fully alive and not really fully dead, emphasizes the distinction between the precise life state of an organism and of our ability to accurately determine that state. In other words, you're either alive or dead at every second, but it's oftentimes hard to determine whether you're alive or dead at a given second. Okay, so what's the definition of death that he wants to move towards? A prerequisite for analyzing the definition of death is understanding the nature of an organism, and especially the concept of an organism as a whole. Okay, now, in defending this idea, an organism, he says, comprises hierarchically arrayed, interdependent units or subsystems. Okay? And functioning components of an organism create unique phenomena that are known as emergent functions. Okay, so when you move up the hierarchy from like cells to tissues to organ systems to the organism itself of you or I, the functioning components within each layer or in each part of the hierarchy can sometimes have emergent functions. Okay? Why are these functions called emergent? Well, it's because given the normal coordinated presence of bodily components in an operational unit, like a cell, the new function, like in the tissue, emerges spontaneously, and so on from tissues to organs, or organs to organ systems, or organ systems to the organism as a whole. Now, so he says the life of the cellular, tissue, or organ components, while often necessary for the life of the organism, is not equivalent to the life of the organism. An organism can even die, despite some of its component parts remaining alive as a consequence of technological support. I'm going to come back to that quote later. He says the organism as a whole refers not to the whole organism, in other words, like the sum of its component parts, but rather the term organism as a whole refers to the emergent functions of the organism that are the consequence of the normal operation of, but greater than the mere sum of, its component parts. The idea here is an organism is somehow greater than the sum of its parts. Okay, that's my words, not his. For many years, scientists and philosophers, he points out, have attempted the daunting task of identifying the criteria for life. He gives some history of this, and then summarizes the work of Raphael Bonelli and colleagues. They observed that all life forms have a delimited unity that is characterized by 4 criteria, and then Bonelli and colleagues added to this by identifying 4 criteria that make a life form an integrated, unified, and whole organism. Completion is one, indivisibility is another, self-reference or autofinality is a third, and then identity is the fourth. All right? Bonelli and colleagues concluded that the death of an organism is the loss of these 4 characteristics, the second group of 4, that render an organism no longer capable of functioning as a whole. Okay? Now, Bernat says, in our contemporary technological era, in which skilled physicians with advanced technology can maintain the life of component parts of organisms outside or inside the body, the continued life of the organism versus the continued life of its component parts has become ambiguous. Okay, so a necessary but not sufficient feature of the organism, a necessary but not sufficient feature of the organism as a whole is the integration and coordination of its component subsystems by a central control system. Okay, now this is an interesting move that Bernat makes. And then, of course, the question becomes, well, what is that central control system? And he surveys a couple different views. Julius Cornian first championed this idea and thought that the brain was it. Alan Schumann kind of is attracted to the idea, but says it's not the brain, it's somehow something that includes the spinal cord and other structures outside of the brain. The President's Council on Bioethics tries to accommodate Schumann. Schumann replies that the President's Council on Bioethics was close but not quite. However, the important thing is these criticisms about what's the control center, is it the brain or is it the spinal cord or what? These are criticisms of the criterion of death, but they're not criticisms of the definition of death. The definition of death being the irreversible cessation of the organism as a whole. Okay, that's a definition that both the President's Council, in its recent opinion, and people like Alan Schumann both accept. Okay, so what is the